Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Can everybody hear me? In most cases, people can hear me even without a microphone. So, my name is Mark Shelton. I'm head of collection development here at the Gutman Library. I'd like to welcome everybody to another Gutman Library Distinguished Author Series event. And this one is extra special because it's co-sponsored with the Civic and Moral Education Initiative. So it's one of their Colloquium series events as well. As you see, we do have refreshments, so feel free to get yourself something if you're feeling thirsty. And we do have copies of the book that we're discussing here today available, so definitely pick one up, since it's one thing to hear everybody talk, but it's another thing to live the full experience by reading the full book. So without much more ado, let me introduce Professor Mira Levinson, Associate Professor of Education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who will introduce our distinguished panel, as well as lead most of the conversation during this afternoon's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm really thrilled that we get the chance through the Civic and Moral Education Initiative to co-sponsor this with Gutman, which really does all the work. We just gladly coast in. And I'm really, really pleased that the Gutman Distinguished Authors Series includes Peter Levine, talking about We Are the Ones That We Have Been Waiting For, and entirely in the spirit of the book, actually has a public dialogue and conversation, deliberative conversation, about what's contained in the book. My guess is that we will be, in fact, having deliberative conversation not only about what is contained in the book, which we might describe as the facts of the book, and also the values that are represented by the book, but we will also be talking about the strategies that are in the book and trying to strategize together up here, and then ultimately with you all about how we can contribute to the renewal of civic engagement in the United States. And that is the focus of the book. Peter's going to describe it to us. Thinking about how we can combine facts and values and strategies to actually renew not only civic engagement, but more to the point, use civic engagement as a way of renewing American democracy and solving what Peter calls the wicked problems that face us of our time, which are certainly worth trying to tackle together. I am here very briefly to introduce our incredibly distinguished panel and also the perfect panel for this book. Peter is exemplifying the strength of networks with multiple nodes and very strong nodes and pulling this together. I'm going to give you much less of a sense of the amazingness of the people at the table than you can get, say, on Google, and because I'm trusting you can get it on Google, I'm not going to go through their lengthy biographies. To start with, Peter Levine, our author for today, is probably known to most of you. He is officially the Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tufts University and Tisch College. And I think many of us know him in particular as the director of Circle, which is the preeminent source for research on civic education and engagement among youth in the United States, is the source of literally thousands of media reports about youth civic engagement and education, and has done an incredible amount to shape both research, well, really all of research policy and practice on youth civic engagement and education in the United States over the past now 10 or 11 years. You had your 10th anniversary last year, right? And Peter is also, he writes in his book about sort of having multiple nodes and thinking about how people interact by having multiple overlapping networks and how important that is. Peter is the preeminent exemplar of that. He has networks with more people engaged in civic life, civic democracy, building the deliberative democracy, civic engagement than anybody I know, and as so, he exemplifies the principles that he will talk about. Then we're going to hear from Marshall Gans, who is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School, and even, again, thinking about sort of beyond title to impact, He is one of the reasons that we talk about President Obama in his first and second term as the developer and force behind much of the civic organizing, social organizing around Obama's campaign, and in teaching not just the Obama advocates, but literally thousands upon thousands of members of nonprofits, community organizations, media, sort of you name it. He has done the work of helping them think about how to organize effectively. He learned a lot of this work by working with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers for 16 years, where he was the director of organizing. And then he continued his work, and now he teaches at the Kennedy School. We're then going to hear from Jenny Mansbridge, who is also a professor at the Kennedy School. She's Adams Professor of Political Leadership and Democratic Values. And in a very strong way, she is one of the academic, she's sort of one of the founding mothers, I suppose, of research into civic engagement at a grassroots level, at an interconnected level, at the town level, and then moving, and in a deliberative democracy. She wrote a seminal book, Beyond Adversary Democracy, which is both an empirical and normative study of face-to-face democracy. And then she has other books, other articles, and has really created an intellectual field that did not particularly exist. And then we will hear from Jenny Sazama, who is doing, if any of you have children, and I'm assuming you live in Massachusetts, your children are now going to be participating in work that the youth that she works with did. So she is the director and co-founder of Youth on Board, which is a nationally recognized youth organizing and youth development organization. They work in part in Boston, and the Boston Student Advisory Council, which is a group of young people, ended up developing the Friendly Feedback Form in the Boston Public Schools, enabling young people to give feedback to their teachers. That has become adopted statewide and is now part of the teacher evaluation policy starting this year. Is it it
got pushed back. It's going to be next year.
Okay, starting next year, but is doing extraordinary work on youth voice, youth engagement, civic education, and thinking about how youth can be a productive part of our democracy. So this is really a phenomenal group. I'm so glad that you're here. And the way that we're going to work is Peter will talk about his book for about 20 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes each of commentary from our three panelists. I will ideally say nothing, but those of you who know me know that I may say something, but then we will throw it open to the audience. Okay, so Peter.
Thanks, Mirren. One of the disadvantages of this format is nobody introduced you. And
that's fine.
Well, she's also illustrious, and I hope you will say things, because I want to hear what you think. And thanks to Mark for having me and to my great panelists. And to all of you for coming. You're the ones we've been waiting for. I'm going to try to be really concise, and I think I will succeed because I've been giving this kind of versions of this on the road quite a bit, and so I have it down to 22 crisp minutes. To try to give you, in some ways I wish it could be even shorter because I really want to hear what they have to say, but you presumably want to know sort of the outline of the book so that you know what they're talking about. So I had been giving this talk around the country at less sort of illustrious institutions, but with very good people in the room. And I think you already know this, but I will report that they are pretty angry, whether they're in North Carolina or California or anywhere else. And obviously a lot of the anger is appropriately focused at the formal institutions of government like that US Congress that's giving us things to be angry about. But I think people also resonate to the idea that the problems are deeper and more pervasive, and that we're part of the problem and that we're also part of the solution. And so this is a book about, us as part of the solution. And a piece of it is the argument that we can actually make a difference to the kind of problems like deindustrialized cities, pervasive crime, incarceration crisis that the government, even when it's not in crisis, fiscal crisis, is unable to handle. So here's a little evidence of that effect, and this is just a taste. This is a map of Chicago, and it's really based on Robert Sampson's work, of course, here in the sociology department, although this is the Times' graph, which is very helpful. And it shows the various neighborhoods of Chicago. The finding is that Chicago neighborhoods where residents are organized and active see much better results in terms of education, health, crime, than neighborhoods where citizens are less organized or less active, quite separate from race and income. So these are the neighborhoods by poverty, homicides, and social cohesion, which is Sampson's term. Let's zoom in to one particular neighborhood, which is Chatham. Is that how you, Jenny, is that how you pronounce Chatham? Do you know? Okay. Chatham, thank you. Excellent. Okay, well, you can keep me on my toes, too, because... so Chatham is described in the Times, anyway, as racially segregated, overwhelmingly African-American, economically challenged, threatened by occasional random violence from outside the community, but extremely organized and effective. The reporter in the Times, Benedict Carey, says, Chatham has more than 100 block groups, citizens volunteers who monitor the tidiness of neighborhood lawns, garbage and noise, as well as organize events. Zooming in further, this is Officer Thomas Wortham IV, Chicago police officer, detective, Iraq war veteran, nationally recognized civic leader. While off duty one night in Chatham, he was shot to death outside of his parents' house. So I just want to pause to say that nothing that I'm about to say takes anything away from the tragedy of that. That's a human tragedy. But what's interesting for our purposes is that Chatham's residents immediately took action, because it was not only a threat, not only a tragedy against him, but also a threat to the neighborhood. So they immediately started crime watches, nightly crime watches, and demonstrations of the community's cohesion, which were so effective that literally no crimes were reported to the Chicago Police Department for the next 6 months in an area 6-block radius around the shooting. Now, I'm not suggesting that we let government off the hook. The residents of that community have a right to good police and good schools and housing and everything else wherever they live, and the government is part of that. But the government acts a lot better when citizens are organized and active. After all, everybody in Chicago has the same police chief and the same school superintendent, but the people in Chatham get considerably better services day to day because they're better organized. And although this is a fantastic book, Great American City, it's not just Chicago. I won't go deeply into this, but this is some of our own research by me, but mainly by Kay Kawashima Ginsburg and Chai-Yun Lim, and it looks nationally at states. We also looked at counties and cities, and whether the degree to which they were civically engaged, showing features like talking to neighborhoods and to neighbors, doing favors for other people, attending meetings, volunteering, how that related to their economic success over the last 5 years. And those states and also communities in which people showed more social cohesion performed considerably better, to the extent that their unemployment rates are now some 2 percentage points better when you control for everything else than they were than their comparable states. So, in fact, made it the degree to which they were socially coherent or active or engaged mattered much more than any of the other things we looked at, including things like housing price inflation and state policy and a whole range of other things. So I'm skipping over this quickly, but part of the book is evidence that it actually makes a difference to be civically engaged. It matters to solving our deeper problems. But that still leaves so it's a book about citizenship. But that still leaves a lot of thorny questions about what good citizens should do and how they should think and what they're like. What makes you a good citizen? So Oxford University Press put a bunch of good citizens on the front cover of my book. I don't even know exactly what they're doing, but they're obviously being good citizens. And so I suggest we go into this one's head and see what he's doing. And potentially, possibly, he's thinking this. A couple of people in this room, 3 or 4 people in this room have heard me do this before, so I apologize. But possibly he's thinking, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And as my former students know, I'd like to ask two questions about that. The first is, oops. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Oh, I took my punchline away. It's too dark. But it says, who said that? So that's my first question. Who said it? Probably. Yes, exactly. The correct answer in the sense of a multiple choice test is Margaret Mead, but in fact it's not attested and she may not have said it. And I sort of doubt she said especially the second of those two sentences. But the second question is she right? And if I yield myself just a couple minutes for a quick discussion, let me just actually ask you. Throw out some answers to that question. Is that true? Or do you agree with that?
Disagree. I think a small group can have a small impact on a small area. It requires a large number of citizens to change the world.
Thank you. We can start editing it. Other responses. Let's just collect a few. Anybody think she's right? Yes.
Other things have changed the world. Wars, technological advances, lots of things changed the world.
Not very thoughtful.
Plagues.
Right. Stupid and careless people, possibly. Yes.
I would just add a couple of words serve as the impetus for changing the world.
Aha. That's perhaps a response to Mark, because usually the conversation goes to the point that maybe small groups of people start the big things. Couple more comments. Concerns, rebuttals. Anybody want to speak up for this? Why is this so popular? Why if half the people in the room use it as their email signatures? Yes.
It
Yeah.
gives people an incredible sense of hope, you know, because you can't, changing the world seems impossible, but starting with a small group of people to spark something, the idea is to spark the beginning of change with that.
Right. So there's clearly an ethic involved here, which is speaking to us in some way, right? And perhaps trying to increase something that we might call hope, which is in itself a civic resource. Just in the interest of being concise, I mean, several other topics often arise when we have this conversation. One of them is just normative or question of value. So is there an implication here that thoughtful and committed citizens always change the world for the better? Now, I admit she didn't say they did, but that's sort of why people use the quote, because they assume that thoughtful and committed citizens make the world better. And, you know, Mussolini was very thoughtful and committed and had a small group of citizens originally with him, and they made the world a lot worse. Dan?
What's small?
Right. More than one, I would say. But yeah, no, good question. All right, so actually, the people who have taken the Summer Institute of Civic Studies know what happened. We talk about it a lot, and we end up editing it. And so at one year, they actually made us, my colleague Carol Sultan and me, a T-shirt, which sort of was the edited version of Margaret Mead's quote. It's more complicated, is my point. And it's getting very complicated, so I actually want to boil it down to a simpler framework. And Mira actually alluded to this. I think a good citizen has to think about three things, has to think about them together, none of them subservient to the others, none of them more important than the others, none of them detachable from the others is what I meant to say. Strategy, values, facts, and evidence. Facts and evidence, perhaps the easiest thing to explain, although certainly it's difficult at this point to find common ground on what counts as a fact in public debate. And clearly facts are related also to thorny questions about methods. And so we could actually talk about that in greater detail. But I'd like to zero in on the two other components here. Strategies. I like to push people on strategies because I think often what we call strategies aren't strategies. So it's not a strategy to say, for example, that the government should provide high-quality education for everybody, or that there should be more police on the streets in Chicago. Those are wishes. Those aren't strategies. A strategy has to explain how you and I, because we're the ones talking to each other, can get the government to provide those things. So the strategy has to include us. It has to start, we have to have a place in the strategy. And yet, it can't stop with us because we don't have the capacity. So we could tutor a kid, we could go on a block, we could do a neighborhood watch, but we can't actually stop crime in Chicago. So the strategy has to go from you and me to something much bigger. And I said you and me instead of just me. Why don't I just start with me? Because, for two reasons. Because purely individual actions are usually ineffective, but also for a deeper reason that I want to bring out. Because I think the good life is lived in common. Toddlers demonstrate parallel play, sitting side by side but doing their own thing. With maturity comes the ability to play together, to decide together what to play, to learn from the other players, to bring new players into the game, and to make up new games. That's what we do when we're truly active and responsible citizens. Not only are the results better, but we lead deeper and richer lives when we strive together. I also want to say something about values, and the point is pretty simple. Your values, it's not enough to have values and to act consistently with your values. Your values have to be the right ones, to put it provocatively. Often we treat values as if they were just opinions, tastes, preferences, or biases. We teach people, in fact, to think of them that way. But I want to provoke you by saying that moral sentences can be right or wrong. I'm standing here at this podium. I must not kill a random stranger for fun. I say those two things are both true. The methods we use to know them are controversial and difficult. But it's easy to see that some opinions about values are contemptibly wrong, not just Mussolini's or Chairman Mao's, but the opinions of everyday people who happily waste more than they create, burden society and the earth, and sow more sorrow than joy. To say that morality is a mere matter of opinion is to deny the existence of vice and evil. So, facts, values, and strategies are the three things we need to think about. And we have to put them together to address the only serious question, which is, what should we do? But how can we think that way? What method do we have that puts these things together? Certainly not the scientific method on its own, because it's aiming for value neutrality, to wipe out that. The method that I know is experience with democratic practices. It's to gather, more specifically, it's to gather experience with real-world practices that you admire. And the way they usually start is with some kind of attractive values, principles, or goals. But the practices typically don't work at first. And they're dedicated proponents, and the values are typically unrealistic as well, and one-sided. But their dedicated proponents learn from experience, adjust their understanding of the facts, adjust their strategies and their values. That can certainly go wrong. The leaders can compromise in a bad way, forget their guiding principles, just plain sell out. But in the best cases, the ideas get richer and more powerful and more complicated as they develop. And I've been deeply privileged and lucky, plain lucky, to spend the last 20 years doing kind of highly engaged research in a series of fields whose core principles I admire. Youth civic engagement, which includes social studies teaching and work outside of the classroom like what Jenny does, and community organizing, broadly defined, deliberative democracy, which I sometimes think of as the most talky and least action-oriented of the pieces of community organizing, but still valuable for that very reason. Civic media, all the efforts to kind of fill the gap created by the collapse of the traditional media, and some others. And I think I detect, and I must admit this isn't systematic research, this is sort of reflection, three principles in all of those practices. Deliberation, collaboration, and civic relationships. So I think, first of all, that citizens deliberate. Deliberation is trying to decide in some kind of group what the group should do, or what should be done. It's worth it, because by talking and listening to people who are different from ourselves, we learn and enlarge our understanding. We check our values, strategies, and facts with other people. We form ideas about topics that we didn't even consider before we talked, and we make ourselves accountable. This is a picture of a formal deliberative event organized by America Speaks, whose board I have served on for a long time. So all those people were recruited to be representative of the community. They were given balanced materials, we hope balanced materials. The process is supposed to be neutral, and the organizers are supposed to respect and admire any result that comes out of the discussion. So deliberate efforts are actually made to keep organized groups from swamping the room with their own followers, or otherwise to manipulate it. And I flash it up there as a fairly pure example of deliberative democracy in practice. It's at an extreme. That isn't a pure example of deliberative democracy. You recognize the picture? So people are nodding. But this is Arlen Specter getting yelled at in 2009 because he was one of the members of Congress supporting the Affordable Care Act, who held what they called town meetings to discuss the issue. Except, of course, what they were actually doing was standing up there for a few minutes to present the position they'd already reached, and then ask people to come one by one to the microphone to say what they thought, which is just a recipe for you're just asking to get yelled at like that. My point being that the idea of a town meeting, which is supposed to be a deliberative forum in which we decide what we're going to do together, was made mockery of in these events, and that shows you that our political institutions don't know what deliberation is, even when it's in their self-interest, because it would be much better for him to have had a deliberative event. He wouldn't have gotten yelled at. But deliberation, oops, I keep on pointing to the wrong computer. Deliberation is not enough. Talking without ever acting is pretty empty. You can say almost anything without learning from the results or affecting the world. A whole group can come to consensus about a stupid idea if they don't put it into practice. So deliberation is most valuable when it's connected to work, when citizens bring their experience of making things into their discussion, when they take ideas and values from deliberation back into their work. And work is especially valuable when it is collaborative, when we make things of public value together. At least sometimes we should be part of groups that talk about what we should do, then actually do what we've talked about doing, then reflect on the experience, holding ourselves accountable for the results. These are kids in a AmeriCorps program which may or may not be adequately deliberative in that they may or may not get to decide what they're doing, but they are working, they're putting up a wall. And in fact, Americans are pretty busy doing civic work together. A quarter of us volunteer every year, for example. Lots of us do civic work in our paid jobs. But I think we need to embed a greater degree of reflection and more diverse discussions in our common work. And actually, I'm much more interested in that than in doing more of the one-off formal deliberations that I mentioned earlier. Getting towards the end here. Why do we deliberate and collaborate with other people? I think typically because we seek civic relationships. Here's another one of these big deliberative meetings, but look what this citizen is doing. She's turning around and talking to the person behind her. She wouldn't show up if she didn't have that opportunity. She certainly wouldn't enjoy it if she didn't have that opportunity. Civic relationships are not friendships or financial partnerships or romantic relationships. They fill a different need. They have a different logic. For example, you should have lots of them at once, which is not true of romantic partnerships. But they're not free of affects or emotion either. I would emphasize especially loyalty, trust, and hope. She wouldn't turn around in her chair to talk with a neighbor if she had no hope, and if she wasn't going to form, if she didn't have some sense of loyalty as a member of a common group. So I want to say just a little about how people think, and this brings up what Mira talked about in terms of networks. Do you happen to keep track of my time?
Only sort of. I think you're at 15 minutes.
Good. I should be done in 5. So in the book, I suggest that we think of any individual's moral and political thought as a network of ideas. The nodes in the network are opinions or judgments, and the ties are various kinds of connections, logical implications, similarities, generalizations. So this is a map for the sake of just illustrating, a map of the moral worldview of W.H. Auden's great but also super famous poem, September 1st, 1939, which you just might happen to know. And I've just mapped, it's a poem that begins, well, it's the poem written on the night of the beginning of the Second World War. And I've just identified casually, not in a very careful way, the ideas that pop up and the connections among them. Auden, in a sense, maps the connections among a whole range of ideas, some concrete and personal, some abstract and general. In a more commonplace example, as a parent of a kid in a school right nearby here, I might support a certain policy because I care about a particular kid. a policy, let's say, involving equity, or I might come to support the policy because I respect a leader in the school, or because of an abstract principle like utilitarianism, and my network map will develop like this. I think a strong network, like a moral network, does not, like any real network, does not rest on a single node so that you can knock it out if you disagree with or come to doubt that, that belief. You should be able to navigate through your own thinking by more than one path. But at the same time, it's not that every idea you have, every stray thought is of equal value. Gradually, you should be building up ideas that are linked to more things and that matter more to you than other ideas, because some things are more important than other things in the world, and also because your character, your evolving character, is defined by those clusters of ideas that really matter to you. Moral thought is deeply social, so I've just mapped the ideas of a single poem, but actually Auden was in relationship with other people. We learn constantly from other people. We share our ideas, individual ideas, with other people. Each idea in my network is shared with many of you, sometimes because you've actually, in some cases, actually given it to me. And so a good network is one that enables valuable discussions with other people. And I think we could say several things about the way a good deliberator's network is contrived. For example, that person doesn't return constantly to a few non-negotiable principles. Every time you ask them anything, they go back to the same belief, because then you just can't deliberate with them. That person has a good deliberator has lots of ideas and insights, and because each one is a point of contact. A person who's got a rich moral life is like an organic molecule with lots of surfaces for other molecules to bond with. Above all, your network should constantly be informed, enriched, and challenged by your shared experience with other people. Your own ideas may be partial or even badly biased. You have to check them with other people, with other human beings. That's the role for deliberation. Let me go back to the bigger model. That's the role for deliberation. But even a diverse group can agree on unrealistic and harmful ideas unless they try them out in practice and reflect on the results. That's the importance of collaboration. And in exploring one another's moral network maps, we form richer and fuller and more valuable relationships with other people, which is the relationship part. All right, so that's the whole model of citizenship. And I just want to put it in a slightly broader context. First of all, I've already suggested that if we had more of that, we would actually have better governments and stronger communities, and hence better social outcomes. And I won't go back to the details of that, but I showed you those graphs, right? The second part of the model that I just want to fill in is about how we get more of this. And I won't go into it deeply. We can talk about it in discussion, but we're certainly not doing very well at generating a lot of citizenship so defined. We don't teach it in schools. We don't fund it. The media doesn't cover it. Journalists don't have any idea what I'm talking about when I talk this way, so it's not reported. There are a few rights, legal rights to any of this kind of thing. So we're not, and for those reasons and others, we see demonstrable declines, I think, in this kind of citizenship. So then the question is, how do we get more of it? And the argument in the book is pretty straightforward. I argue that we need a citizens' movement to work on citizenship, to promote the structures that would encourage more citizenship. The challenge is that if you ask the average person walking down the street, or if you had the money to buy a Super Bowl ad and broadcast a message, people are going to have a very hard time wrapping their minds around the kinds of fairly rich forms of civic behavior that I've been talking about, because they haven't had experience with them, because we don't teach them, because we don't practice them. So very, very hard then to ask lots of Americans to fight for relatively abstract policies that would support greater degree of civic engagement. But there is good news. In the book, I argue that there are about 1 million, and probably that's an underestimate, adult Americans who any given year are deeply involved in some form of civic work of this type. Typically, they are, I think my next slide suggests the list. It's these people. It's the people involved in these kinds of movements, plus some that I haven't mentioned. Let's just skip ahead. Plus people in fields that I haven't worked as closely with, basically, which include the struggles for civic and political rights and civil rights. Also, the efforts to manage and strengthen threatened public resources or common resources, whether those are watersheds or forests or fisheries or public libraries or the internet understood as a common resource. So there's the whole world of common resource management. And then related to that, the whole world of alternative economic institutions, the people, well, Danny LeBlanc, for example, the people trying to build community development corporations, social enterprises, land trusts, alternative economic institutions that are more accountable to publics, less able to move, more likely to engage in deliberation, collaboration, and relationship building. I think these citizens, people involved in that kind of work, do understand what civic engagement is, see the need for it, but very typically they are working on their own thing. They're working on school reform in Boston or community development in Somerville. Their silos that we're all forced into are geographical and demographic, but they're also issue areas. So the civic environmentalists are in one place and the school reform people are in a different place. What we need to do is to find common ground, temporarily and partly, not completely, on the agenda of boosting this kind of citizenship. And that means starting to talk about things like the funding, legal rights, media coverage, and so on that flow into citizenship. So I end, yes, good, perfect. Have I really won, or are you just being polite? Okay, so I end with two appeals to everybody I talk to. If you're not involved in any of this kind of stuff, get involved, it's easy enough. All kinds of nonprofit groups and government agencies as well are busy organizing deliberation, collaboration, and civic relationships. But I strongly suspect that everybody who shows up to listen to me talk is involved. And then my request is a little more subtle and difficult, which is find people who are involved in different parts of this work and start connecting on the common barriers and objectives that you have as a field. So, thank you.
I'm going to have to head out right after this because I have students waiting back over there. So it's not a reflection on anything other than that fact.
I think you should do it
when
well,
I
yeah.
depart. Yeah, so, okay. So thanks, Peter. In his new book, Peter focuses attention on important sources of challenge, possibility, and pathways forward. First, I really appreciate the way you began your book with your intention to do normatively committed and politically engaged scholarship, which the world needs a lot more of. Taking on what's clearly a major, if not the major challenge of our time, the dysfunction of American political institutions in dealing with almost any of the major challenges facing us right now. A challenge that goes well beyond questions of inefficiency, because it's cutting to the core of our capacity for self-governance itself, and self-government itself. Second, I appreciate Peter's view of the citizen as engaged in a process of learning, growth, and development, a kind of transformational activity, as opposed to the citizen as consumer, invited to interest-based exchanges, making choices to be sure, but choices about what deal to make with whom in exchange for what. In Peter's view, politics is about facilitating the exercise of agency, not simply choice, but agency as informed intentionality, not thin individual agency, but a thicker kind of choice embedded in deliberation, collaboration, and relationships. It's a really important distinction. I find myself arguing with advocacy groups about the difference between marketing and movement building, in which advocacy groups seem particularly confused about whether they're trying to build a movement relationally or whether they're trying to market a product as they would to consumers. Peter makes that distinction very clear. Between, for example, strategic and relational organizing, messaging from engagement, mobilizing from organizing. And I would add to the list the whole enterprise of libertarian paternalism known as the nudge approach, which is getting a great deal of attention, certainly over at the Kennedy School, and I imagine I know other places as well. It just seems to me, well, I won't go there. He also makes a helpful connection with the way that market solutions to public problems may work to undermine democracy by recasting the voice-bearing citizen as an exit-taking consumer, which is an important. So he focuses on the fact that this is about people and how people work and how people think, grow, develop, not simply about utility functions and choice points. Third, Peter addresses the question of where do people go to acquire the civic skills this kind of citizenship requires, since it can no longer be learned through the great voluntary associations of the past. In other words, developing civic capacity for governing purposes is related to developing civic capacity outside of government. Fourth, I really appreciate the approach to democratic experimentalism. Roberto Unger's phrase from Realizing Democracy, he talks about that values-based politics can in fact be exploratory, not confined into an ideologically narrow spaces, but rather opened out into a pragmatic process of exploration and learning, emergent and pragmatic. And I think that spirit is really an important spirit to bring certainly to where we are now. And finally, you found a lot of bright spots, sources of civic light, where people in fact are acting as citizens, so we aren't facing an utterly bleak picture. Now, having said that, I'm surprised that there is, and maybe this is not the book you chose to write, surprised that so little is made of the structure of American government itself. Designed in the late 18th century by local notables as suspicious of democracy as they were of kingship, creating a polity that at the local level had to tolerate slavery and freedom, and fearful that what they called a tyranny of the majority could use government to create change. So they created institutions that weighted some people's votes more than others, and introduced veto points at almost every legislative, executive, and judicial level that would make it very easy for a determined minority to block use of the state to make change. The shape of these institutions, whether we think of them in terms of the way districts are designed, the Electoral College, the Senate itself, has everything to do with why individuals might choose to participate or not, but more importantly, why those who mobilize others to participate might have an interest in doing so or not. I mean, in a presidential election, nobody cares to mobilize New York or California. It's just not relevant. Let's go to New Hampshire. And it makes a mockery of the whole notion of equal voice and democratic promise. But unable to initiate change through state structures, except through times of war mainly, Americans still needed change and did turn on the one hand to civic associations, as described, as noted by de Tocqueville, as ways to combat the radical individualism he feared. But the other model they turned to came out of the Second Great Awakening, the Protestant religious revival that swept the country in the early 19th century, the result being the American social movement. And we don't hear talk about the social movement in the book at all. But the social movement, not as a fad or a fashion, but purposeful campaigns of moral reform, organized to assert public values, requiring individual, communal, and institutional change, and mobilizing political, economic, and cultural power to win that change. And although self-interest was often motivation enough to sustain a status quo, it turned out that moral purpose was required to motivate the depth of commitment, the courage, and the imagination needed to challenge the status quo. Rooted in effective local organizing, but strategized nationally, and initiated outside of political parties, they often transformed the parties and through the party's public policy. So this is a form of powerful civic engagement that seems outside of what's being addressed here, or maybe hoped for at the end. And I'm talking about everything from the temperance movement to abolition to suffrage to populism to the labor movement, civil rights, women's, environmental, LGBT, and the conservative movement, which I think is another example of a very powerful, morally grounded social movement that has been so successful. So given the significance of the interaction of social movements, electoral politics, not just civic associations, it was also surprising that little was made of the explanation for why we are the way we are, and why this seems to be so much of more of a problem for progressive values than for, shall we say, conservative values, which I think is a pretty valid claim. The significance of the struggle over race, and secondarily gender, and the whole consequences of the 60s and 70s for creating this kind of place in which we find ourselves now. So the omission of social movements, it seems to me, is an important aspect here. That relates to a second concern, which has to do with the treatment of values. And values do matter. Of course they matter. And you focus a whole lot on strategy and on deliberation. I mean, I think your discussion of deliberation is terrific in terms of the learning and so forth that occurs. But when we would do campaigns, we needed a strategy, we needed a structure, but we also needed a story. And by a story, what I mean is a capacity to mobilize the emotional resources for courage, for solidarity, for trust, for risk-taking, for all of that juice that it takes, so that it isn't just about deliberation that we need capacity, but also celebration. That the capacity of communities to honor their values and re-energize themselves from the emotional side, not just the cognitive side, is absolutely critical. And unfortunately, it's a side that often is ignored in academic discussion about values themselves. I just been reading Martha Nussbaum's new book, Political Emotions, Why Justice Requires Love. It's a terrific book and addresses this question directly. The final comment is just in terms of looking to sources of hope. I sure hope those people could become a source. I think generating the kind of energy for change we need requires an intersection of pain and possibility in such a way that it can spark. You know, people don't organize around inconvenience. It's around injustice. And we see that, I think, in immigration reform. We see it in young people like this weekend on Power Shift, the thousands that were gathered for the Power Shift training around climate change. I think there's something emergent like that throughout the whole world of healthcare. I think in education, it's very interesting what's happened there. But I think there are these reservoirs of moral energy that we need to pay a lot more attention to. Figure perhaps how that couples with the capacity developed that you point to. So perhaps we can find ways to launch the sort of reform that it would take to address the challenges that we face. Thanks.
Would it be? Can you hear me if I just talk from here? That's great. Okay, this is a hard task because I read the book and I said, "Yay!" I mean, and that's takes less than 10 minutes. So then I had to think, what else am I going to say? Because I agree with pretty much everything that Peter says. He's got his four value. The primary value going on here is pragmatic experimentalism, and that's the value that we all should have, and it motivates this book in the deepest way. Facts. He's got depressing facts. He's got lots of things you need to know about the decline of civic engagement, the increase in inequality, the geographical sorting of the population into blue and red, the malevolent effects of Citizens United, and then comes along another chapter with the great facts, the exciting facts of all the different people that are different doing great stuff around the United States, getting together to make a difference. And then he's got his strategies and a pretty inspiring 10-point plan. All right, now that's, also less than 10 minutes. So what I will say, I'll say two things then. One is, very short really, that this might be part of a wave. Maybe we are at the beginning of something. Maybe not, but we might be. And then secondly, I'm going to say that I don't think there's enough conflict in this mix. And this is from somebody who wrote a book called Beyond Adversary Democracy, trying to get us off the adversary, get us off the dime of just always talking about conflict. So, okay, so let me talk first about the wave part. Of course, we've been talking about civic this and that for a long time. But it's possible that this time is different. Nobody predicted the civil rights movement. In fact, you can get wonderful quotes from people right before the civil rights movement saying nothing like that could ever possibly happen. Nobody predicted the feminist movement. Nobody predicted the environmental movement. And so we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But we do know that there's a building up of frustration around not working together. So there's Peter's book, there are other books. There's a guy named Gar Alperwitz who just wrote a book called What Then Must We Do? Straight talk about the next American Revolution. And the subtitle is, or the Democratizing Wealth and Building a Community, Sustaining Economy from the Ground Up. And the ground up is where we're all at here in this room. You wouldn't have come probably to this talk if you weren't a ground up person. And I think it's just possible that in the frustration and anger around what's going on in the United States, we might possibly see something in which Peter's book can be the inspiring book that it is for many people, many people. It might be part of a wave. Who knows? I mean, I'm not making any predictions, but I feel, and of course we all feel, the need for this, for a movement, and maybe there might be one. Gar, for example, points out, he uses the word quiet democratization everywhere. He points out that more than 130 million Americans, 40% of the population, are actually members of one or another form of cooperative. Now, that means including credit unions, and including electrical co-ops and food co-ops and so forth. But if you actually look at it, 40% is not bad. So these are the kinds of things on which we can build as we do community, not just community talk, but community as at work, as Peter points out. And Ben Barber's just written a book called If Mayors Ruled the World, which is about how a great deal of our initiative and our power is at the municipal level. More and more people are moving into cities. This is us. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So now I want to talk about the talk and work and engaging in together, but I'm going to put more conflict into the mix than I see in Peter's work. And let's start with America Speaks. Peter showed you a picture of a wonderful organization called America Speaks that brings people together to discuss public problems. And Archon Fung at the Kennedy School, along with a guy named Taiku Lee, has done some studies of this. What do people like out of America Speaks? They don't like to be at a table where everybody has the same perspective that they do. They also don't like it to be in huge conflicts. What they like is a disagreement, so that they can engage with disagreement, engage with conflict, but not with conflict that gets too frightening. So we're all yearning for getting together with people who are actually a little bit different, and America Speaks brings you to that. Now, Diana Mutz has done some work asking, where do people meet people who don't agree with them? Not in your neighborhoods, not in your churches, not in your families. The place you're most likely to meet people you disagree with are at your workplace, because you're thrown together there. It's not as self-selected as those other places. And so she points out that all these participatory wonderfulnesses that we're all in favor of, we're getting together with people very like ourselves. We select, we don't want to go, might want to do it in America Speaks one evening, but not over and over and over again. For the people we want to get together over and over and over again with, we want them to be like ourselves. So participation is actually a little bit against getting together with people who are different. Now, what Marshall, who's no longer here, did a wonderful study with Theda Scotchpole showing that the kinds of organizations, what Bob Putnam calls the animal clubs, the elks, the lions, those kinds of organizations that they had in the old days, which crossed class, we don't have so much anymore. Politicians, for example, when they list all the stuff they belong to, they don't list those much anymore. That Theda and Marshall did a little study of that. And so with the hollowing out of that, you still do though have, this is America, you have people coming together in these civic associations, and it's not all divided by class. Peter quotes a study done by Jacobs and Cook and Carpini, saying that 25% of Americans have attended a formal or informal meeting to specifically discuss a local, national, or international issue. 25%, that's a lot. That's a lot of us. Those are the people, and it's not particularly, it is a little bit more upper class than working class, but not more white than black, and not more old than young. So this is what we know how to do. We just need to do more of it. Now, back in 1908, Mary Parker Follett, who was the person who invented all the skills they teach you over at the business school on negotiation, she became chair of the Women's Municipal League Committee on the extended use of school buildings. What school buildings got to do with it? When you meet, you need a place to meet. And often, meeting in people's houses is a way that frightens off the people who don't know the person whose house it is. If you meet in some place neutral, like a school building, that can be, particularly in mixed neighborhoods, but in working class neighborhoods, that can be a place where all of this stuff happens. And Mary Parker Follett and her progressive folks got together, got Boston to pass a lot of legislation funding all sorts of stuff in using school buildings after school for circles, a working men's circle, people coming to talk, people coming to learn skills. And then there was a recession. And so what got cut? The funding for those, and it never came back. Now, I've only got 2 minutes, so I'm going to get to the conflict stuff, because that's all the talk about, the getting together for the good stuff. I think it's really hard to engage, to even, I myself don't know how to do this or think about it very well, to think about how to do the wonderful building a bridge. Peter has a bridge place here where he talks about, so some neighbors, the neighbors love a local stream and are concerned about its health, and thanks to them a pedestrian footbridge is built, and because they designed it, it meets their needs, they feel ownership, they feel dignity, they feel satisfaction and agency, and that's all great. Everybody agrees that there ought to be this wonderful bridge over this wonderful stream. There's no conflict involved there. There are not some people who say, I don't want to spend taxpayers' money on that, or I don't want to, whatever, that bridge is getting in my way in some ways. So we need to build into our models how both to work communally together, but also how to struggle in the civic war that is electoral democracy, and also how to negotiate deals among people who disagree. And you have to put your self-interest on the table. A lot of this rhetoric is non-self-interested rhetoric. It's we rather than I. It's us. It's the common good. But often we do have interests. And if women hadn't said in the beginning of the women's movement, it's not just about the common good. Women have actually interests that differ from those of men. And we've got to stand up for our interests. If you don't recognize conflicting interests, you don't put them on the table, then you can't negotiate them. So I worry about the sort of undertone of some of the praise of all of these wonderful building of bridges over rivers and whatnot, that it doesn't face the fact that most of us hate conflict. And we have to learn to do conflict well as to do commonality well. And I don't think any of the sort of civic stuff in wonderful civic program, when you teach kids civics, I don't think it teaches them very well how to do conflict. And so that's what I would add as more than a footnote to the book, but a kind of suggestion for the next book. The next book can be, I hope this wasn't what we were waiting for, no. So thanks a lot, Peter, for writing this book, and I hope you guys will all go and get it.
Well, my name's Jenny again, Suzama, and I was invited here to this panel to talk as a practitioner. And there's a little story about some work that the young people that I work with have done in this book. But first I wanted to say is young people aren't as scared about conflict as adults are. And that young people have been leaders and at the forefront of most social movements. Their lives are set up so they can do it. They're not as discouraged. They're hopeful that change can actually happen. And I think that we need to be centering this work around really focusing in on young people. They are not the future. They are the ones that live in this world now. And what I always tell people, ask a young person what they think. Ask a young person what they think and ask them 10 times, because the first 9 times you might not get an answer because they're not used to anybody asking them what they think. And what I like about this book is that it's talking about the solutions. It's talking about actually how do we get to solutions. We know the problems. People aren't voting, people are hurting each other, people are setting up systems that are very inhuman, and society's in some trouble. We've been in trouble before. The capitalist system is collapsing in a different way, in a new way, in a faster way than it has been. And young people are very aware that they might not be aware of the bigger picture of why this is happening, but they're aware that things aren't right. So what I wanted to talk about was the way Peter talked about deliberation, collaboration, and civic relationships, and tell you a little story, a success story that we had in actually using that format. We didn't know Peter's language when we were doing this, but I think he studied groups like ours and came up with the concepts that he talks about because of what you've seen in us. One of the stories is about young people in Boston. We did a survey of 888 students about their homework, and 50% of the Boston Public School students said their homework was horrible, right? That's a lot of students saying their homework's horrible, right? So we talked, why is homework horrible? And who's holding teachers accountable to homework, right? What's going on? Is anybody asking the teachers is anybody helping the teachers with their homework plans? So we said, all right, well then who's evaluating the teachers? Who's giving the teachers feedback, right? So we went through a whole deliberation process. The young people talked to each other, they deliberated, they decided, okay, so what they decided to focus on was not necessarily, we focused some on the homework policy, but we focused on students. They said, we're the ones that are in the classrooms getting this bad homework, and no one's asking us how bad it is. We're the ones that have to go home every night and do this, right? So they came up with a plan that they wanted to evaluate their teachers. So they then went and began to deliberate with different adults in the room. Different adults in Boston. And the adults said, no. You are never going to get student feedback in teacher evaluations. Never going to happen. The teachers union, great relationships with them. They sat across the room from us and said, we will never let this pass in Boston. It passed. But we went through a whole deliberation process and decided to start with the piece that Peter writes about in his book, which is students giving constructive feedback to their teachers. The Boston Teachers Union did decide that they could get behind that, right? So we collaborated. We collaborated students and the teachers union. How radical of an idea is that, right? That the students and the teachers' unions actually have a collaboration around constructive feedback. In fact, this year is the first year that the teachers' union is actually going to be in charge of running constructive feedback in the city of Boston, which I don't know how many of you work in education and work in teachers' unions, but that is completely radical and completely about the last beach, which is the civics relationship, right? It is because we built a civics relationship with them. There's a longer story behind that I don't need to get into, but so we deliberated and then we collaborated with the teachers union. Then we came to, the Race to the Top money came to Boston, and they said that we could not get Race to the Top money unless we reevaluated our evaluation system. The students said, ha. They talked about the structures and they talked about strategies. So they went to the committee that was in charge of reevaluating Massachusetts evaluation systems. And we lobbied every single member on that committee and every single member of the Board of Education. The students of Boston Public Schools did this. They got them to pass a policy that says that student feedback is now part of Massachusetts evaluation system of teachers. And the difference, other states have since done that. The difference in Massachusetts is that we have the unions behind us. And so it's not just a punitive piece that says we're not, there's a lot of people out there that are doing a lot of union busting these days and a lot of work to try to put down the teachers' unions and create them as the enemy, so for various reasons. So we did that with the teachers' union, and so we went through a deliberative process. We collaborated with the Boston Public Schools Administration, with the teachers' unions, with other youth organizing groups, and with the Massachusetts Board of Education, and built civic relationships with them that continue. So that's just one story of just a perfect example of the way that, Peter's book gives structure to this. Now, Peter's ending point was that his thesis is that we need a movement of civics, right? We need people to be saying, how do we get people civically involved? Now, people want their issue, right? Like, people probably heard this, but I always like the ocean liner analogy, that there's an ocean liner that's moving along, and this is sort of the negative forces in society, and you keep batting along the ocean liner, and soon you will turn it off course. So each one of us and the projects that we're involved in, and the community organizing, and this sort of trying to get this ocean liner off course, we will, that's where I think that I like Margaret Mead's quote a lot. I feel very hopeful whenever I hear that. But that we're banging it off course. So how do we get people excited about a movement of civics, right? How do we get people excited about a movement where you just have people deliberate with each other and turn that deliberation into collaboration and turn that collaboration into real civic relationships, which then will hopefully lead to conflict and real change. And I don't know the exact answer, but I know one of the answers is that we need to start really talking to young people. We need to be having these conversations with young people and young people of color, or young people of the global majority. Young people of color are beginning to ask me to start using the term global majority. They don't want to be identified just, they are of color and I am not of color. This is also a color. So I like that, global majority, right? So they can talk to you more about their thinking about that. But I do think that young people have to be part of this answer. Adults get very stuck in the way that we think about things. We get into our way, and it takes much bigger things for adults to shift how they think about the world and about their opinions about things than it does for young people. And I think we need to be asking young people what they think. And civics classes that are taught well in high schools that are based in some kind of action are part of that answer. Mira and Peter and I are all involved in an Action Civics Collaborative. And then one last story, do I have a minute? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, is that in Boston, there's a group of us that have been taking this Action Civics and actually moving it to the next level. And the Boston Public Schools has agreed to take civics and bring it out of the classroom into organizations and have our organizations come into the classroom. And I think that is part of how we're going to create the civics movement, is not just get civics classes in the classroom, but get civics classes out of the classroom. Nonprofit organizations, after school programs, there's something that we've figured out. Young people want to come to us. They want to come and they want to talk and they want to debate things. And why are they not wanting to do that in school? There needs to be some connection and learning from both places.
Because of the time and because it would totally violate every value expressed in the book for me to spend time talking, given that we have 15 minutes left. Yeah, no. But I just want to name two things that didn't really come up that I think people should know about the book. One is that this book is really interestingly not at its heart a book about civics and the importance of civics. At its heart, it's a book about the problems that the United States faces, and in many ways that the world faces, and why the work of everyday citizens is essential for resolving those problems. And so that's, I think, really important because it's an attempt not to be actually an internal conversation among advocates of civic engagement and civic education and, preaching to the converted. Instead, it's meant to be an argument that for any of us who care about any of the seemingly intractable problems that we face, whether that is those are poverty, war, global climate change, etc., that the way to address it is through the collaboration, the deliberation, the action, the relationships of ordinary citizens working together. And that brings to the second thing that didn't come up as much as I think it might have, which is that Peter is incredibly deliberate and intentional about weaving through virtually every chapter numerous examples of people and organizations who are doing this work. The fact that he features Youth on Board is not a one-off. We learn in depth about Bridgeport, Connecticut, about Hampton, Virginia, about Seattle, Washington, about umpteen organizations as a means of demonstrating that this is not just some sort of pie in the sky thing. It's not a couple of idealists. It's not that you have to have some great, charismatic achiever. It's that this work is going on all around us and is making a tangible difference. And that's, I think, a deliberate part of Peter's strategy to try to recruit us into it. But I think that's the one important piece that I didn't hear addressed. But at this point, my guess is that you may want the opportunity, Peter, to respond to some of the considerations.
They were all great comments, and I have things to say, but
I think we'll throw it open.
Yeah.
So, questions or comments? Yes.
Your message is extremely powerful. May I share this with you? Just one comment and one question. Every now and then, I work as a substitute teacher.
yeah.
After the end of the mandatory Pledge of Allegiance, I make a 3-minute conversation regarding what you promulgate in the book. Please note, I don't have problems in that classroom for the rest of the day. It sets a particular tone. But secondly, I want to ask this of you. For many of the children that I work with, the parenting style is not mutual. It is top-down. The other issue is this for the children. Often they take the position that if you disagree with someone, they don't like you. Or, they don't know how to exactly compromise in terms of having two distinct, points of view or opinions, especially when they come from backgrounds, either they're out-hollered or they're physically forced to take another particular position. So what would you suggest as far as an urban teacher in terms of dealing with something like that? But at the same time, too, don't take the position that what I'm doing is better than what your parents are doing, because I don't want to make it adversarial between the parent and the school.
Do you want to address that? I actually have one piece of an answer, maybe, but I don't really have. You know much more than I do about that, but you probably have it day to day.
I think what you do with the conversations is that I find that the more that young people actually sit and talk to each other, like there was a school that I was working at a few years ago, and a very dear young person to a lot of people got murdered. And so we spent the day going around, and we trained the teachers to actually try to have conversations in their classroom about this. What I reminded them was that in the 80s in Boston, It was actually young people. The police got credit for it. Clinton, maybe it was 90s. Clinton came and gave the police credit for the drop in the crime rate. It was actually youth workers and young people that actually dropped that crime rate. And how it changed was young people actually talking to each other. They said to each other, don't go retaliate. It's not worth it. Your life is too worth it, right? So how do you get young people, even though they come from that, what I love about young people, I mean, you know, you're getting to be a substitute teacher, is they're open. So even though they come from that and that might be how they think about things, when you actually spend enough time, we spend a lot of time at my work talking with, like, the young people talk a lot about what they think about things. That's most of what we do, right? How do we strategize? How do we think? What's your opinion? A new person comes in, we spend a lot of time talking. So my answer would just be to keep doing that, I think, and then actually have them talk about how they think decisions should get made. I don't know.
Peter, did you want to? Oh, Jenny, yeah.
I don't know anybody in the business schools or law schools where they teach negotiation courses who has tried to work up let's say a small curriculum on how to do negotiation that would work for fifth graders. I don't see why that can't be taught to fifth graders. I don't see why it wouldn't be fun for fifth graders to role play. You know, to be given a couple of things where people have conflicting interests, and they're told, well, what are you going to do about this? I think that you could, but I've just never seen anybody in those fields address themselves to that age group. I think it could be done.
Peter.
You know who taught me? Jack Parr, Steve Allen, Dick Cabot.
Yep.
By osmosis. And what made it all the more powerful, it wasn't a lesson. But I learned about civility that way. I don't think young people can do it alone. I think adult has to be there as a gauge. You know, I agree that students have to talk to each other, but the adults need to be there to kind of temper the conversation too as well. But thank you very much.
Peter, did you want to?
Well, just a nugget, which is we surveyed 720 social studies teachers last summer, and it's only their perspective because we didn't survey the parents, but I think picked up some intimations that there's a problematic relationship between teachers and parents about the discussion of controversial issues, because a quarter of the teachers who teach American government said that their parents would object if politics came into the classroom. This is the American government classroom. But also, a lot of the teachers in open-ended responses said very negative things about the parents, that the parents basically brainwash the kids, and the reason that the classes are no good is because the parents have brainwashed the kids. So I think we have to figure out how to work on that relationship.
Interesting.
Next. Yes. Sorry, we're sending you.
I have a big voice. I'm going to raise the banner for my daughter, who is a social studies teacher in New York City, third generation in our family, educators. And she is really loudly advocating now as a middle school teacher that there isn't enough education around civic engagement at all. And the time is right. These kids have voices, but social studies classes in the middle school are being cut dramatically because it's looked at as a non-essential course to the literacy and numeracy classes that are taking place. And I would advocate, as my daughter does, that the social studies is equally important. And you can teach numeracy and literacy through social studies. But as a policy, we're missing something in education when we're dropping that, because these kids do have really fun voices that need to be heard, and it is their world coming. So
My son would say it was more important.
there you go.
He's so
That
sick
would be
about
my
it.
daughter too. She raises her banner high and just gets very angry when kids' voices are shut down, because we're molding them right now at the middle school level. I mean, I used to, as a high school teacher, I used to confront high school kids and say, you know, you are a rebel without a cause. Now let's talk about James Dean and how we can make that you have a good cause, and let's use your voice appropriately. And we do miss that. We really do miss that. Not just the young Pledge of Allegiance elementary, but all the way through K-12.
Peter, do you want to talk about the C3 frameworks for a minute?
Or you could.
No, we wait. I mean, you were our
Well,
lead.
we did this
civic
together.
teacher.
So I mean, the connection I would make is we are in an education school. We didn't really talk much about education. In fact, this is my chance to write a book that wasn't about what I usually do, which
Right.
is civics. But it does, I think, have strong implications. And the big implication really is that kids should be learning deliberation, collaboration, and relationship building, which means not learning immense amounts of minutia about the way the U.S. Constitution works. Now, they need to know some of that because Marshall raised a really good point, which is that when the system's broken, we're all frustrated, and you have to understand how the system works. But they get, to the extent they get civics, they get too much of a lot of detailed facts, and they don't get the stuff that we were talking about. So, yeah, so we've been both, and many other people in this room, but we have been both working to try to change that. The latest vehicle for that is the College Career and Citizenship Framework for the Social Studies, which the National
National Council for the
Social Studies has released, which is a framework to guide states as they revise their standards. And I would say that those three themes are in there and woven in. I mean, under the heading of action and reflection, basically, is a slightly different way of putting it, but they're in there. So,
Yeah.
But the implication would be, there is a pedagogical implication from what we've been talking about today. I would just say, I don't think that civic education can bear the burden of restoring citizenship in America, because all those adults aren't going to be permanently affected by what they did in one class in middle school, but there is a pedagogical implication.
And is there a way to have the action piece? What I love about the action civics and what we're trying to do in Boston is when I learned about government was as an adult when I wanted to change a law, right? Like we were working on with youth organizers, and I thought, oh, well, I need to start learning who my representatives are and who we go visit. And then I needed to learn the structure of who had voting power and what the mayor in Boston's role was and why he was so powerful and why he was more powerful than other cities. So is there a way to bring, and I didn't learn, and I took civics in school and it went all the way, gone. So, is there, and I don't know if that's one of the things that you're pushing, and I know that's tricky for schools to actually be able to figure out, but there be I would love for there to be a mandate that every civics class has to do an action project.
It's
not
there.
A service project.
I not necessarily project, but these new frameworks have an inquiry arc that culminates in taking action. And that also, there's a lot in there about the kind of deliberation that needs to take place in classrooms and practicing different kinds. Jenny, you look as if you need to disappear. So it's fine if you disappear. I am going to violate, I'm going to violate our norms, even though it's 5:31. And why don't we take 2 more questions without responses yet, and then, or maybe 3 questions.
Although I like the idea of responding to Marshall and Jenny when they're not here anymore.
Right, yeah, that's perfect. So maybe we'll do 3 questions quickly and then let the last, it'll be like Haydn's Farewell Symphony. And make them quick questions.
So I was really intrigued by the emphasis on values. So, from my point of view, that's been kind of overlooked. Citizenship as developmental, moving towards better citizenship, and the recognition that there's such a thing as bad citizenship, I think is important. And so, from my personal point of view, I would see that as kind of maybe the overlooked part of that triangle, or maybe it's even more than, maybe it's really at the center of everything. So, from that point of view, I was just wondering, where is the kind of developmental piece or the leadership piece? Because there's almost a paradox between the idea that citizenship is developmental. We learn, and I think we really do learn through through deliberations. I think all of that is developmental. But then with so much focus on youth citizenship or just civic engagement, I mean, bad citizenship with more engagement doesn't necessarily produce a good result. So how do we create civic engagement that has leadership built in, that has the embracing of younger minds for the purpose of developing them, and they're not, when they're voting age, there yet. It takes decades more for them to really have the wisdom. How does that work in?
Great. And do you want to pass it up to Sherry? Yeah.
My question was in terms of the definition of global citizenship and or the definition of a good citizen, I guess, and why doesn't it explicitly talk about what it means to be a citizen of the world rather than a citizen of the country? And if we are just building patriotism that's leading to insularity, if we don't really address that explicitly.
Great. All right. So thank you. We'll turn it to.
Yeah, although there's two. Well, and maybe we can keep talking informally.
Yeah.
So-
And you should also informally buy the book and eat some food.
And eat some food.
Yeah.
So they're both great questions. I'll take the second one first. I mean, citizenship for me is not defined by some state, and it's not defined in relation to the state. So you can be a good citizen and be, for example, not documented citizen of the United States. I do talk about this particular nation state as the context. Part of that is just limitations of my ability to write about something bigger. Part of it is a little feeling that I actually agree a lot with what Marshall said, that those structures at that scale powerfully influence the way we do work, and that they're in very bad shape. So I agreed with 95% of what he said, but the part that I disagreed was the part that I was sort of blind to the institutional structures of the federal government, because I actually think that I'm pretty serious about those. So, but we'd also have to think about it at the global scale. I just didn't give you that book, partly because I don't have the ability to. And I think on the moral, yours was more of a comment than a question, but I think the first thing you have to do is banish an easy relativism, which says that there is no right answer. And it's very hard to figure out what is the right answer, but thinking that there isn't one ends the conversation.
Do you know, I just one definition that the young people that it sort of nationally came up with in some national organizing was that a good policy is one that's pro-human. So if it's not pro making humans, you know, and of course there's a lot of definition within that, but I like that as a general beginning. You know, that they will argue that there is absolutely a right and wrong. You know, and these are majority young people of color, majority poor young people, and yeah, that if it's not a pro-human policy, then it's wrong.
Animals are nice.
Animals are the best.
And I think one thing you didn't say in response to Andrew's question is that one of the really, as I said before, you are a bridger, you know, extraordinaire, right? And too often the civic renewal groups who you listed, civic media, youth, you know, civic education among youth, community organizing, deliberative democracy, and so forth, tend to operate in their own, ironically isolated worlds and talk to one another and think about, say, how can they influence the national media or policymakers or whatever, but we don't exist in a broader coalition. And you've been really working hard to create a larger coalition. You know, it's gone through you much of the time. Now, ideally, it will go through this book and through others. But that, I think, does attend to the developmental and the leadership considerations, that it is about creating a continuum of civic engagement, not for the sake of civic engagement, but for the sake of actually improving the world. So I do encourage you to buy the book, to eat, to network, come up and introduce yourselves. And thank you very much to Mark Shelton and to the Gutman Library for hosting this.